Hello, I'm Michael Parker. Welcome to Antidote. Today we're going to be talking about the way forward in the aftermath of the horrific Friday the 13th attacks in Paris. What do we do now? Where do we go? How do we move forward in a positive sense? Joining me in the studio is my friend and colleague, international relations expert, Philippe Assouline. Welcome, Philippe.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me.
I followed you on social media this weekend. You had a lot to say, so I want to give you the floor first. Explain, give me your thoughts on where we're at right now.
Okay, so, well, some of what you've seen was me trying to not succumb too much to outrage that everybody's feeling now and anger. People will have a tendency to lash out when these things happen. I think it's perfectly understandable. And one of the posts I put was proposing a way forward, so we can talk about that. I think the most important thing now in terms of what to do as the West or what the Europeans should do is, first of all, you have to identify the problem. And I see two tendencies that are kind of missing the boat. On the one hand, is just saying it's ISIS. And we want to isolate one group as if it's some organized structure and the problem ends there. You know, like Cobra Commander almost in G.I. Joe. You get rid of this organization, everything's fine. Mm-hmm. And on the other end, there's the traditional effort to try to rationalize terrorism away in a way that gives the West or Europe entire control, right? Oh, it must be our foreign policy. Therefore, if we stop the foreign policy, the problem will go away. It must be desperation of people. Now, these things might feed into it, but I don't think they're the ultimate problem. But those answers just give Europeans the sense that they can keep controlling the problem and make it go away. And if you think of it, Paris was struck less than a year ago in very serious ways, right? But they killed journalists and Jewish people. So the Europeans were able, even subconsciously, to kind of rationalize that away. Oh, it's not targeting me. There's specific reasons, right? The journalists did this. The Jews, there's a conflict in the Middle East. It doesn't really... Now, it's affecting everybody. These guys went into a concert hall and slowly, methodically gunned down 89 to 100 young people, maybe 120, the counts vary. But slowly for 2 hours doing this, that had no connection to anything, had never done anything wrong. And that's going to force, I hope, Europeans to take this more seriously. But the problem is not just ISIS and something you can solve militarily. 9 people did this, right? They had the world paused and focusing on this. 9 men who, most of which, maybe one came from Syria, it seems, but most of which were born in France. Maybe second, third generation, young Muslim Arabs, I think. And so you have to deal with the issue of indoctrination. And there's a very big reticence to deal with that because that means we can't control it. We can try to fight it, we can try to fix it, but we don't control it. As opposed to, oh, it's our foreign policy, then we could just end it, like the Canadian government did, right? That's a misguided thing because there are some ideas that are bad, and if the last 115 years have shown us anything, it's that bad ideas, if you don't deal with them early, metastasize and end up killing tens of millions of people, God forbid. That's what Nazism did, that's what communism did, and now we see it with religious fanaticism or politicized religion, whatever you want to call it.
When I look at ISIS, I see a complex issue. I understand Hollander's approach that he now is bombing Raqqa. I understand that righteous anger. However, when we look at ISIS, we are looking at an idea, and ISIS's identity and its relevance is tied to wreaking havoc. If they're not doing that, they are not relevant. And what concerns me is this isn't a single group or a place that we can go and fight them. It is an idea that spreads, like you said, and they are dependent upon affiliates, they are dependent upon sympathizers to act out on their behalf. And what makes it even more complex is then sometimes there are people who just want to watch the world burn, as to quote the movie. ISIS can then take credit for those horrific acts. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened in Paris. Clearly, this was an organized event, but it makes it difficult to figure out how we are going to move forward against them. What do we do?
I think you raised a lot of very important points, and people don't realize this. First of all, now ISIS is 2 things. What differentiated ISIS from the other jihadi groups, and unfortunately there's dozens of them, is that they didn't want only to commit violent acts in order to slowly destabilize the world, in order to slowly bring about the caliphate. They just built the caliphate. So they were about land. And in the Middle East, they still are about land. But recently, maybe because of all the bombing, they've started to act like Al-Qaeda. okay? So just trying to get lone wolves to read stuff on the internet, become infuriated, become indoctrinated, and go carry out these acts for which then they can claim credit. So there's a nebulous link. If you look at the situation, you step back and you look at what France has done. The people came from France, from suburbs in France. You have the poison being taught in France for decades now, like in the rest of Europe. And they went and bombed places in Syria, right? There's a complete inability to even look at the problem. So France lashed out. I'm not saying ISIS in Syria doesn't deserve to be bombed. Of course they do, but that's not going to solve the problem. The problem at base, the West would do better to focus on Facebook than bombing. If you want to eliminate the threat in European and Western cities, because it's probably in North America as well, not to the same extent, you're probably going to have as much of success if you focus on Facebook and social media. There is absolute poison going on Facebook now.
Agreed.
Entire pages supporting jihad, promoting the murder of Israelis, promoting the murder of other people, supporting ISIS, Twitter. So once in a while they close one page, but then 100 spring up, right? That has got to be part of the plan. Now, 30 years ago, the Arab world was not producing this, not nearly in these numbers. There was some jihadists going to Afghanistan, but that was more or less the extent of it. What happened is that you had an exporting of these terrible ideas through Gulf oil money for their own political purposes, basically exporting their crazies after there was instability in Saudi Arabia and setting up these madrasas that turned, for example, Pakistan, which was a Sufi country, this very mystical, more peaceful version of Islam, into Salafist, which is violent, intolerant form of Islam, which is what these terrorist groups usually adhere to. In 30 years, they've done this through promoting and pumping education to these schools. Why can't we use covert means to have alternate schools, for example, or programming or content that allows people to be Muslim, but in the way they were 30 years ago or 50 years ago, where this wasn't, what the media was, or social media was showing as the way to be Muslim now, which is basically to be at war with other people. Why can't we, try to return Pakistan to its Sufi state 30 years ago? Or also, Europe needs to get more involved in its community's values. And we talked about this last time.
Yes, we did.
Multiculturalism is basically abdication. The way it's being practiced, just lazy, wishful thinking. Let's just leave them there and hope they become what we want them to become. That's just not going to work.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in our last talk, I think that some people misconstrued what I was getting at, and this is a challenge. There are people within countries who do not want to assimilate. So we've got to figure out how to get them to assimilate. And it is our human nature that, if I'm from here and you're from there, I tend to migrate towards my group, you migrate towards yours. And depending upon our open-mindedness to the culture that we have now come into, we may just sit back, reap the rewards of being in a particular country while adhering to the true values of the country that we left. So I don't know how we fix that. But yes,
it's certainly not by ignoring the problem. Now,
right.
The criticism when you bring up anything related to values is very sanctimonious and very preachy. Oh no, you can't blame them. A lot of people are impressed by that. I'm not. I think it's just an effort to rationalize away the problem, right? If you blame us, that means really we have control, and you're treating these terrorists or wherever they come from as children that we can, if we really wanted to, we could fix it. What is it? It's just reassuring ourselves that we can solve the problem, but it's not the case. You have certain people, a small percentage of Muslims in Europe, who have toxic values because of what we just talked about, right? Indoctrination, social media, these Salafist madrasas or mosques that are being funded from elsewhere. And then, events also perpetuate this. You have to look at this when you're trying to integrate immigrants into your society. To have a lazy approach is just not going to work. So part of that is economic. You need to give them another way of fulfilling themselves. But you also have to be honest with yourself and say there's some people who come here, a minority, who have a vision that is not to integrate, but rather to conquer. Right? When people are in London and they're holding up signs openly in front of in Piccadilly Circus or in the middle of the city saying, behead those who insult Islam, right? Now, even if this is 25, 50 people, if it's 1,000 or 10,000, a small minority, it still matters. Because they go out and preach, and they slowly establish regions where the police doesn't like to go. And the wishful thinking we've been doing so far is not working. There needs to be with Muslims, because the only people who can fix this are Muslim scholars, I think Arab ones in particular, because this is more or less a Middle Eastern problem. You have to make sure these values are not taught. And I mean, it boggles the mind that President Obama is not even willing to name it, or very rarely to name it, right? As if coddling this ideology is going to help anything.
And unfortunately, that further polarizes our country. When I look at Facebook and I look at my friends, and you know, I'm from the flyover states, I'm from Texas, I see a great deal of just rabid hatred now towards Muslims. And listen, the people that are committing these atrocities make up a very small percentage of them. However, that doesn't matter in the minds of some. And by Obama not calling this what it is and facing it entirely, it allows continued ignorance to occur.
Absolutely.
And it just becomes even more divisive, and the problem's still there, and we haven't fixed anything.
Absolutely, and it's extremely important what you're saying. Again, people who don't even want to name the problem or come up with these feel-good hashtags think they're being benevolent. All they're doing is encouraging the divides between people. Because people watching at home these attacks in Paris are naturally afraid. We all were, right? And you're outraged, and you're angry. And we have no reason not to believe what these perpetrators are saying of why they're doing it. They're being fueled by a certain religious ideology, right? Whether it's authentic or not is not the issue. They're being fueled by this. And then you have politicians who are coming out all mealy-mouthed and afraid to name it. So people's frustration and outrage and fear is not channeled anywhere constructive. And so then you have demagogues who come up and say, it's all Muslims. It's about all immigrants. We're going to block all Syrians from coming. And people need an outlet. They need a leader to make them feel safe. So the extreme right ends up winning. We need the media to show much more of the moderate Muslims. Now, I'm not going to be polite about it. I don't think there are enough of them yet that are willing to forcefully speak out on the basis of Quranic teachings against this violence, but there are more and more, and it's very encouraging. The media does nothing to show them, right? It's always showing these caricatured, stereotypical positions, either
which
the extreme jihadi or jihadis or apostates, which it sells everything. It's a very simple narrative that people like. And then you have the politicians who go around blaming everything except for what the people are saying. Like there's this very weird and bizarre form of Orientalism going on now, where Europeans will look, since the 1990s when Hamas started blowing up buses in Israel, right? They have no qualms about saying what's motivating them. They make videos before dying, so you have to assume they're being sincere, telling their families why they did this. And it's all based on end-of-days apocalyptic religious interpretations of certain Muslim texts, right? That the majority of Muslims reject, but it's still part of what a lot of people, unfortunately, believe. And yet you have these European and Western leaders who will look at that, listen to it and say, no, I know better. It's because the foreign policy, or it's because of lack of money, or it's because of lack of integration. It's really like superimposing our political preferences, what we can understand, almost why we would see ourselves committing such acts, over what they're saying. We need to listen to what these people are saying, because that is what is driving them. That is what they believe is driving them. And that is the only way that you can actually differentiate between this small minority who is causing terrible damage. 9 people did this in Paris. And the vast majority of Muslims who are increasingly being caught between the sides, right? Because again, if the politicians, if the leaders we elect are not willing to confront the problem in an intelligent way, the demagogues will exploit the fear of people to make it against all Muslims. And then we will have an actual clash of civilizations, which will be a disaster.
These men who committed these acts this weekend, they were young people with their entire lives ahead of them. And they were so committed to this that they strapped bombs to themselves. I don't get it. I do not understand how you can commit yourself to such a thing, but you were explaining before the show that these people do have this belief that there is this end of days situation and it's going to take place in Syria.
Listen, religion is a thrill. I've been through younger days, when in my late teens, early 20s, when religion was appealing to me. If you look at Western history, it's a history of people willing to die and kill for religion. Even if you go into the 20th century, right? Nazism and communism, They had a religious structure, those ideologies. There was a God, there was a vision of how the world should be, a utopian vision. There were rules of behavior and thought. The religious impulse is very strong in people. And if somebody believes sincerely that they're going to go to heaven, now there's a whole other issue of like honor culture that we need to talk about. But it's throughout history, it's motivated people to do things. Listen, let me put it to you this way. Why do we have separation of church and state? If you listen to these European leaders and President Obama, you do not need separation of church and state because religion apparently has no effect on politics. So why should we have a separation of church and state?
Because of course it has an effect on politics.
All of Western history proves that it's the most important thing is to separate politics and religion, which has not happened in the Middle East. On the contrary, they're one and the same there. So we need to get beyond these platitudes that make certain politicians feel good, while they're actually fueling the fire, right? I think American policy has contributed to instability there. France just bombed a central command of ISIS. So what has the US been bombing for a year, if not that?
That we also touched upon in our last conversation, because from the get-go, I have to admit, I do not think that our supposed war against ISIS was totally genuine. And there was that article that we discussed in which, I forget the journalist's name at the moment, but it looked like, we weren't really bombing these camps and things that we had information about.
And the Russians certainly aren't either. They're bombing the West. They're bombing... People have become entirely or almost entirely jihadis as well, but not with global ambitions. It used to be the Free Syrian Army, but it's increasingly been co-opted by local jihadis.
So are you saying that you don't think that Putin has truly been bombing ISIS establishments? Is that what you're saying?
He hasn't. Listen, ISIS serves the purposes of Russia and of the US in a certain way. In a certain way, I have to be very careful.
I understand.
ISIS makes Assad, who is a butcher, who is the current president of Syria and has killed upwards of 100,000. The war has cost up maybe 300,000 people by now. ISIS makes him look moderate.
Yes.
ISIS is the best argument for Assad.
ISIS makes everyone look moderate.
Right. And so Assad, who's in power, might seem like a better option now. And for the US, it was, in certain ways, it's pressure on Assad. The US doesn't want Assad there, but it doesn't want to do much about it. So it's convenient. And we know, for example, that Turkey has aided ISIS in the past. So it's very ugly what's going on there, and then you listen to the speeches and all these, feel-good platitudes about what's going on, and I don't see any genuine effort to address the ideology. But the ideology is not the only problem. There's a certain political culture in the Middle East we need to talk about.
The issue that I see also with ISIS is that there are these various groups, each of which have their own desires, and ISIS blunts the issue on many of them. You talked about Turkey and the Kurds, and each of these countries have different issues. Certainly Assad, it makes him look like a better situation, but...
The devil you know.
Of course. And so ISIS benefits from this culture, which brings us back to, so what do we do now?
Listen, I gave you my best bet. First of all, we need to accept, and this is extremely hard for people, I think like us who grew up in the unprecedented comfort of the last few decades in the West, where everything's been idyllic. Thank God, the biggest threat in my childhood was whether I would slip on ice. At one point, there was a bit of fear of kidnappers, and it was just basically if somebody talks to you, don't answer and go get a grown-up you know. Now we have to deal with the reality that there's a very big and scary danger there. So that we don't control. So I don't know if there is a situation. That's the message, first of all, we need to accept. Maybe there is no situation and you can only manage the conflict the way the Israelis are trying to manage it.
Right.
But what I told you, what I think the best solution, that I can think of is, apart from the military, where you have people basically Nazified,
right,
like ISIS, going around exterminating Yazidis and Christians and other Muslims who don't agree with them. You need to deal with them militarily. There's nothing you can say about that. But really covertly and overtly choosing to promote an ideology that is authentically Islamic and peaceful and compatible with the West, to fight this version of Islam which is destroying the Muslim world and coming now to our shores. right? There is a version of Islam that is perfectly compatible and aligned with the West. And these people need religion. Most people on the planet need some kind of religion to deal with the hardships of life. Give them something where these competing visions that are violent are not as appealing to them. We need to do that.
I understand that. And as when I was reading some of your posts, one person made a comment that I thought was interesting, which is that, let's say we are able to covertly fund some of these madrasas that teach.
It could also be content, movies, songs, like culture, something that's appealing emotionally to people.
And listen, I don't want this to be true, but somebody pointed out, well, wait a minute, don't you think that, especially in the case of madrasas, if some of that funding is coming from the West, then people are going to go, well, I'm not going to go to that one because, but yes.
I think repetition is magic. I think the more you do it, the more chances you have of succeeding, and we don't really have a choice. Yes, if it's overtly seen as some kind of Western brainwashing thing, obviously it's not going to work. But I'm talking about taking Muslim scholars who exist, who are teaching against violence, who are risking their lives, unfortunately, even when they're in the West, to say this kind of jihadism is not compatible with Muslim values. We need to, first of all, protect and support these people, protect physically and support them. We need to honor them in a way, but so you can do things covertly where it doesn't have to have such an impact. Look, Egypt, since the new president, there's a lot of problems with the way he's been dealing with Islamists in this country, but the programming in Egypt has changed. Every year for Ramadan, you used to have TV series in Egypt that were rabidly anti-Semitic, okay? And then after a few years, leads to violent or hateful actions.
Certainly.
They started changing it in subtle ways. So they had a series this year where there was a Jewish family that was one of the characters in the show, and they humanized Jews, and a lot of people respond to it very positively, okay? You can do things like that. These things have a huge impact on people. Apart from that, now all we're doing is bombing or semi-bombing, and that's just not going to lead anywhere, because a lot of this ideology fuels on the notion that these people in the Middle East are always victims.
Right.
No matter what happens, right? 9/11 happened, but then the Afghans are victims because America attacked them. The Iraqis are victims. It's always a narrative of victimhood. Sometimes you can't avoid using bombs. I certainly would not advocate using ideology only, for example, like in the Second World War. There's at times you need to protect the innocent. But if you don't deal with the ideological issue, nothing's going to happen.
Understood.
But there's another problem, and we have to talk about it.
Okay.
The political culture in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, is toxic. And that, I think, is even a bigger problem. I wrote a Huffington Post article recently called The Clash of Emotions, okay? The political culture in the Middle East, because of the history of imperialism there, you've never had states, you've never had local national identities, and you had weak governments. Security was ensured by clans, big families. You would find security by belonging to a big family. And these clans or families regulated relationships between themselves through rules of honor. Very different understanding of honor we have. The kind of understanding of honor that leads to honor killings. Now, unfortunately, this is still prevalent. You look at the 2004 Arab Human Development Report, these Arab scholars came together and they said clanism is a huge problem in the Arab world. It's slowly disappearing, but it's still there. And when you have societies that are ruled by these big families, the individual is crushed. And the relationships between them are ruled by blood feuds. You have to project strength or else you invite threat. Because of the environment, historically, the desert, limited resources. This was actually the case in Scotland too. Okay, it was the case in the south of the United States a couple of hundred years ago. When you have a weak government, these families provide security to people. And that means, long story short, that if anything's done to you that looks like an offense, you have to avenge it. And the people
This is like the mafia, what you're describing.
Yes, no, it is the same mentality as the mafia. It's gang warfare. It's like the Bloods and Crips.
And
if you don't avenge in a publicly violent, humiliating way, you invite danger because you're projecting weakness. And at one point, the us-them divides become so strong that people on the other side just become numbers. You're not thinking in terms of individuals, you think in terms of a clan. So you can hit civilians. Doesn't really matter. For me, terrorism is an honor killing, largely. Okay? Now, obviously, I'm oversimplifying. And there's all kinds of dynamics. And there is desperation. And there's individuals who have problems in their lives who choose this to do it. There's foreign policy issues. But this issue of honor culture is very, very important. It's not religion. It exploits religion to those ends. In fact, without making it too complex, I believe Muhammad came and was successful because he provided a solution to this constant fighting between the clans in Arabia, right? Islam, at least the way I understand it at the time, was meant to solve this problem of clan fighting by creating one ummah, one nation. But this toxic culture survived. We were able to eliminate it in the south of the United States, in Scotland, through having strong government that individuals could benefit from, and they didn't have to belong to a clan. But it still exists. And so the idea of vengeance, of attacking civilians, of public displays of violence, etc., is going to endure as long as that's the way that people found security in that area because of the political and environmental situation. There's a book I would like to recommend to your viewers and to yourself. It's called The Rule of the Clan. And it goes through a number of different societies, Western and Middle Eastern and from Asia, who because of the environment and weak governments had to organize themselves in family and clan structures. And therefore, the rules of honor started to regulate the relationships between them. So one of those rules is that if you suffer an affront, you're not going to go all out and destroy the other clan, because then it would never end. So you do limited violence that humiliates them and restores balance. Terrorism is a perfect manifestation of that. And we have to be willing to look at these things. Right now we have these European politicians who, like the Foreign Minister of Sweden, look like these zombies who refuse to look at reality, refuse to listen to what the people are saying, refuse to even consider that not everybody thinks like people in Sweden, and are saying, no, 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 it must be for the reasons that I would see myself becoming desperate and committing violence.
Which brings me to this article in the Telegraph. Paris attacks put the dagger through the heart of liberal Europe. Okay, on its face, I think that is for the moment. I don't know if it will be for the long run, because right now people are scared, they're mad, they're afraid. But I don't know if that puts a dagger through the heart of liberalism in the long run. It's a temporary thing.
I think it depends on what we mean by liberalism. I'm not so sure the ones who call themselves liberals now are necessarily liberals in Europe. But again, if people don't deal with the serious issues, the population that feels fear and frustration and outrage, people lost their kids or know people lost their kids in Paris. Like, this was a bar. It could hit anybody. They're going to turn to demagogues. I'm actually seeing a lot more promising response from the Arab world itself than from liberal Europe. Yeah. The Arabs are the ones who suffer the most from this. They suffer the most from ISIS, they suffer the most from this terrorism, they suffer by far the most from this clan politics that I'm explaining to you. So for example, Assad is a clan-based regime. Everybody in the top echelons of his regime is from his sect.
That's right.
And his family. Saddam Hussein was the same thing. That's why when you remove these guys, the states collapse. Because it's not like you have a professional class of bureaucrats and he's ruling it. The government entirely is of his clan because he doesn't trust anybody else because of these politics. The Arab Human Development Report in 2004 already pointed this out and wanted to start addressing it. I believe in the Arab world there are efforts to start to really deal with this. But it's going to go nowhere if the liberal elites and the politicians in the West don't give them a hand. If you keep making excuses for terrorism instead of shaming it, you're not helping the Arabs and the Muslims who are trying to fix this at all. You're hurting them. You're just helping your own conscience, not even your conscience. You're helping your state of mind. You're making yourself believe it's okay, we can solve it if we really want to. That's all you're doing. And the cost is exactly as you're saying. You have demagogues who will come up and say it's all Muslims, which is completely idiotic. It's not 1.5 billion people on the planet doing this. And the solution is going to come from, it can only come from Muslims. So, but instead you have these demagogues who are alienating all these people and building politics of fear and hatred. And so really I bring it down to the people in power who are not willing to confront the problem in an intelligent, cool-headed, firm but respectful way.
Today at the G20, people are reaching out to Putin, trying to make nice with him, and Barack Obama was very defensive in some statements he made. And I don't know if this is strong leadership to lean on Putin to, because Cameron's saying, hey, we're prepared to make some compromises.
Cameron has had courage enough in a very important speech he gave recently. We spoke about it, I spoke about it here with Margaret, about addressing the ideological problem. And he made some very unambiguous statements, in contrast to President Obama, who the day before was saying ISIS is in check and he still doesn't want to, Listen, President Obama, for good or bad, he believed, I think, that Islamism was a reflection of what people in the region actually wanted. And so he was trying to coddle moderate Islamists. So really coddling the Muslim Brotherhood for a long time, even before the Arab Spring, inviting them to his speech in Cairo. The Muslim Brotherhood is the group that spawned all these terrorist groups. And then the same with Iran on the Shiite side, right? Instead of fighting the regime, instead of supporting the Iranians who went into the streets to get rid of this regime, or at least supporting them so they could pressure it to change, almost complete silence, and now empowering the Shiite jihadis essentially, but definitely Islamists, to a wild extent. He's just going to enrich the coffers of Hezbollah. And what's Hezbollah going to do with that? It's going to fight Israel, but it's going to fight ISIS also. ISIS is going to get money from the Gulf states. I don't understand. And now, President Obama's calm with respect to this issue, the way he speaks with confidence, I find offensive. You have to take responsibility for America's role. Whether it's right or wrong, America ensured peace or a certain calm in the world. Pax Americana is a real thing. And his policies have caused a lot of instability. Whether they're based on the right moral principles or not is secondary. In practice, now you have Putin coming in. Putin doesn't care about all this stuff. Putin cares about Russian interests. He doesn't hide that at all. He will not follow rules that benefit the West or even the people in the region at all. And so these problems are going to get worse.
I do not disagree. And in regards to Putin, I mean, that's one thing I do respect about the man. I mean, clearly, he's operating within the interests of Russia.
Yeah.
And he is not going to be pushed around. When we talk about, listen, I know we brought up in the comments about this show, people will point out, well, none of this would have happened had the instability in the Mideast not occurred as a result of.
But that's not true. That's people who just don't know history. This happened in the West. This is a natural process when empires collapse.
Explain.
Okay. The Roman Empire dissolved in the West, what became Western Europe, very early on, okay? It survived in the East, what became the Orthodox world, the Byzantine world. But it died in the West almost 2,000 years ago, 1,700, 1,600 years ago. It was a long time of people going from an overarching identity and political structure to localized identities, and slowly through a lot of bloodshed and very long and devastating religious wars, coming to the conclusion that they couldn't keep killing themselves because of clans, like I spoke about. Clan politics was the rule in Europe also, and because of religion. They did this in 1648 after a devastating religious war, and it still took them 300 years to get their blank together and build nations where the individual had a right to live, and you could have different opinions without being offended and killing each other, etc. Okay? It took a very long time. The Middle East has always had empires. Always. Okay? You had the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans and the Persians, and then you had the Byzantines, and then you had the Arab caliphates, and then you had the Turkic Mamluks, and a little brief interlude of Crusades, and then you had the Ottoman Empire, which was taken down in 1918 and then 1920, okay? So they've just had the opportunity to start to figure out, what do we do now? And you have a number of competing visions. You have religion, because the Ottomans, the way they ruled was by dividing people. Okay? Each community had its own local ruler that related directly to the empire. That's why you still have these laws in place in Lebanon and Israel, for example, where religious communities control civil marriage or family laws. Anyway, people had to find, once these empires ended, all of a sudden, for the first time in their history, they have to find, how do they organize themselves going forward? Is it religion? Is it clan? Is it nations? What are these things, nations, that the Europeans created with these borders that don't really match? And you have these competing visions. So the first answer in the Middle East was Pan-Arabism. We're all Arabs. We're going to build one state from Morocco all the way to Qatar. It's going to be secular in a different way than we understand secular, and that's going to be the solution. It was very anti-Western, anti-colonialist, anti-Israel. It had a lot of success until the late 60s, and then it collapsed. And from there, there's been competing visions of nation and religion. And they're still trying to figure that out. That is still the conflict now. Do we follow a religious vision, or do we follow a national vision? And you have these forces competing still. It's going to take time for them to sort out these problems.
My concern at the end of the day is that ISIS, which again, on a field of battle, I don't know that they can defeat us. However, by these elusive mannerisms of guerrilla warfare and terrorism, they could draw us into a conflagration, which then turns into a much larger situation. That's my ultimate concern, because ISIS...
You say could as if it hasn't happened, but it has happened. Look at Libya.
Right, exactly.
Libya wasn't created by ISIS, but again, ISIS is
How
just a name.
bad does it get, though?
I don't understand. Listen, Putin makes some valid criticisms of the West. I don't think he's doing them necessarily sincerely, but there's valid criticisms there. Everywhere the West has gone, they've left a mess. The idea, it's easy to talk in retrospect, but after 9/11, which was a devastating blow, and the US obviously needed to do something, but the idea of going to destroy two countries or rebuild, the idea of building countries, right? What is that all about? Why you know, there were a number of different approaches, one of which is fighting the ideology, but also like covert small teams to go through the most problematic people, which is slowly shifting to. But even with hindsight, they participated in the ouster of Gaddafi. Gaddafi is not a good guy, but what they have now is much worse.
Absolutely.
Absolute chaos, and then it spreads to Africa, and you've had terrible terrorist attacks in Mali, in Nigeria, in all these places where these groups are, now that the lid's been taken off, they have influence everywhere else. So there absolutely is a responsibility in Western foreign policy for it. But it cannot be that we blame that and ignore the ideology that's driving all this. Because the West has committed terrible blunders in other places where this doesn't happen, like South America, right? Like India. England, you know, the behavior of England when it was a colonial power there was very questionable. But this doesn't arise. There's an ideology that you also need to address. I think you need to have a multifaceted approach and not putting our head in the sand. And so specifically with your question about Syria, we're on the road now to another Vietnam, only worse. That's what I see, unless something changes. But you have the US funding these jihadis in the west of the country, or the CIA giving them weapons to fight the Russians and Assad. You have Assad, you know, doubling down, and he's getting bogged down there. The Iranians are getting involved. China has been making sounds that it might get involved because it has a problem with Muslim separatists on one of its borders. Nobody's talking about education.
Philippe, when you say Vietnam, I'm saying something, I'm worried about something even worse than that.
It will be worse.
Because one snafu, one international incident, and this could be something totally by accident, that then catapults us into a completely different conflict.
Look at now, France just multiplied its bombing raids in Syria.
That's what I'm talking about, and I hope that this is not how it begins. That's why I wanted the point of this show to be, how do we move forward? And
ironically, the Arabs and the Muslims are our best hope. On top of having to deal with the immediate threat militarily, we need to cultivate and support and promote those who have been speaking out against terrorism, you know, risking their own lives to do it. We have to take a direct interest in what they're preaching at the same time. And we also have to grow up and stop projecting what we want to see on the problem so that we don't have to worry about it at night and we can pretend it's still, you know, the 80s or the 90s. The 90s are over. There's real problems in the world now, and we need to man up. I mean, with the attitude the politicians have today, we would not have won the Second World War. And the media, by the way. We would not have won the Second World War. I was looking at a show yesterday. 50,000 people, 50,000 young Americans died just to take over Okinawa. God forbid we should ever get to that, but that's a level of resolve that people had that we don't have today. Thankfully, I think this problem can be solved in large ways non-militarily, but we don't have near the resolve or the clarity of vision that we need to have.
We're going to have to leave it there.
I spoke far too much.
No. Our hearts go out to the people of Paris, France. It was horrible to see, and I admire the people of France that I've listened to on the radio and television over the last couple of days who say, we will not be afraid. And so,
can I add something?
Certainly.
I'm interrupting, but it's not just France. There's a tendency for us to like just look at the victims who were fashionable. On the same day, there was the massive terrorist attack in Beirut. And
that was the day before, yes.
Yeah, and there was a terrorist attack in Israel.
That's right.
And there's been terrorist attacks in Nigeria and Kenya that have been horrible attacks by Boko Haram that have been being ignored. And so like we need to really not commodify this.
Right.
And look at the broader problem.
And that is a bigger discussion that we'll have to have the next time. Anyway, Philippe, thank you, as always, for coming by. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join us again next week. I appreciate you watching us today. Next week, we're going to have Graham Hancock. He is an historian. I'm looking forward to that. Until then, my name is Michael Parker. This has been Antidote. you, me, every single one of us, we will make the way forward. We are the antidote.